What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the pregame show here on RotoGrinders. Friday morning, I am tucked warm and inside. It is a blizzard here in Syracuse, so happy to be inside. And I've already snowblowed my driveway twice this morning. So as soon as the show's over, guess what I'm going to do again? 2 inches of snow an hour. But we're going to talk some DFS today. We're going to talk pretty much a lot of review of yesterday. And we're going to talk about a big contest on Draftkings tonight and how to prepare for it, because it's a much different contest than you probably typically play on Draftkings. That is, looking over here, a $400,000 tournament, just a $4 entry. You got to give yourself shots in these type of tournaments. What makes it different is it's 118,000 people. There's not too many basketball tournaments that get to this sort of size of people. Fortunately for us, we had one just a couple days ago. It was a $1 tournament, but it was a pretty big, large field NBA GPP that doesn't really happen too often. So we'll look back at that, maybe see how we can prepare for tonight and really take a look at what happened last night. I'm not going to spend too much time looking ahead towards tonight, because there's about 30 what-ifs on players that can play, and basically any content I do towards that can really be stale and old for the people that watch this in an hour or even as the show progresses. So we're really going to look back at what happened last night across the tournaments and have some fun. If you're on the YouTubes, feel free to chat with me. I got that open, and we can have ourselves a pretty good time today. Always click that like button, too, if you're watching on the YouTubes. So the first thing I wanted to do is I want to take a look between, there was I think it was a $2 or $4, $110,000 tournament on Draftkings last night. It was a 20 entry max. I think they juiced the prize pool up a little bit with the micro millions that they were running. And I want to compare the ownership to the big $15, $400,000 tournament as well. And I mean, I looked through this for a little while, and basically everything's dead on. There's basically not a 2% difference in ownership between these contests across the entire board. LaMarcus Aldridge, chalk, he really played well. 42% in the $4, 40% in the $15. I mean, basically dead on, and it's dead on across the entire, 36% on Levine, 38%. 36 on Hutchinson, 38% in the $15. So I don't know if you really have to change, at least based on last night, your play style too much if you're moving around in these contests, right? So it seems like a reasonably sharp crowd, right? The pros can play in this. It's a $4 with a $100,000 prize pool, but it's just 20 entry max. But it doesn't really look like the ownership got too far out of line last night between those two. You got to go down to, I don't even know, a Josh Hart, where the $4 players played him a little bit more. And I don't know, the $4 players might have been a little bit smarter than the big crowd in this one, because he had himself a good game. So I guess the one takeaway from this, and you can look this, it sort of holds true most nights, is the ownerships between these two specific contests. If you play the $4 20 entry max and the big tournament, they don't really change too much. I think you'll see a lot of the 150 entry players that play the 100K will also end up putting some of those 150 lineups into the 20 max, however they choose to do so. I don't think too many play 170 or 400 lineups across all their tournaments or something like that. So the ownership does hold a little bit true. But if you are trying to play these two, and you're playing one contest, you can sort of carry your ownership projections right into the big $15 contest as well, or whatever DraftKings happens to run on that night. So just keep that in mind. I got a question from Maxwell in the YouTube chat, and he wanted to know what ownership percentage constitutes chalk. 30%? And I think that basically depends on a slate to slate. I don't think there's a specific number for that, right? Like last night, the highest owned player was LaMarcus Aldridge at 41%. Tonight, right, there's going to be so much value. Maybe some of those value guys don't get really highly owned because there's just so many of them. But if you just have one or two really extreme value players, those guys can hit 50% pretty easily. And they could even still be a good play, even at 50% ownership, because their point per dollar expectations are just so high. But if we're looking specifically at last night, I think that 30% that you say is probably the chalk. So Aldridge, Kobe White, Zach LaVine, Chandler Hutchinson, Anthony Davis, Luke Cornett are guys I would have considered the chalk. And really the guys that failed out of that were Zach LaVine. I was high on Zach LaVine. We'll take a look at the actual ownership and the $20. That's what I played last night. I played a lot of LaVine. That didn't really work out for me. I also played a lot of Luke Cornett. So those two combined probably sank, I would say, in combination, close to 50 to 60% of my lineup. So I was really behind the 8 ball on that. Tournaments, I think I got back about maybe 50% of my money last night, which isn't the worst outcome in the world, but I certainly didn't have a chart-topping high score. I just had too much investment into these two players. Another thing you want to sort of do in results DB, and this is always in hindsight, right, is looking back at the guys who scored a lot of fantasy points and take a look at their ownerships and try to figure out why was the field or why was I not on these specific players. So the guys, in the top 10 in overall fantasy points that have reasonable ownership or lower, so I would think something like a 15% ownership or lower, why were those guys low owned and why did they end up having a good performance, and how do I think about those type of things in the future to create leverage into my lineup? So let's take a look at Russell Westbrook, who was 8% owned. James Harden had himself a horrible game. I got to scroll down here. Harden was 6.22% owned because he was really high in salary. So why was Russell Westbrook 8% owned, and how can I think about the future Russell Westbrooks that are 8% owned that have great games and get them into my lineup? So here's what happened last night is LeBron James, who was basically the same price, got 27% ownership. And then Anthony Davis, who was, a little bit cheaper, basically in that late game, ate up the ownership. Now, Davis had a great game, playing against the Rockets in this new small ball lineup. Maybe we can take a hint that, it's Anthony Davis, but maybe these bigs who are a little bit capable of being on the floor when the Rockets play small ball are going to have themselves some big games. That's something I'm going to want to keep an eye on in the future. But the main thing was LeBron James. And with LeBron eating 27% of the ownership, this is really how you got to think about things. Is LeBron going to outperform Russell Westbrook 4 out of 5 times? And I think the clear answer to that is no. So these are how you sort of create leverage in your lineups. And if you knew ahead of time, I think our projected ownership was pretty spot on. We had LeBron pretty high and we had Russell Westbrook pretty low. These are ways where if you're trying to play the ownership game, you can sort of get ahead there. Another guy I was pretty high on was Joel Embiid. And even though he just scored 45 fantasy points, right? Maybe you think that's a dud for Joel Embiid. Well, he's still the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, ninth highest scoring player on the entire slate was Mr. Embiid. So Embiid, I liked him for a couple reasons. One, he was cheap. He was like 91 or 9,300. He is ultra cheap tonight. I think he's another amazing leverage play tonight. I don't think a lot of people are going to be using him. And he's just absolutely dominated the Bucks and Brook Lopez and his entire career. And even though he had what you would consider an off game, coming in as the 9th highest scorer on the slate, I think that's a positive for him. So I think Embiid, I was right on Embiid. I think in terms of ownership, I had about 40% of them. It's just I had too much of those other guys I mentioned, like Luke Cornett, too much Zach LaVine is what really ended up sinking my night. I was on Grinders Live last night with Kirkwood. Kirkwood had a couple pretty good calls. He had the over on Hassan Whiteside rebounds for the little sharp side promotion we're going. So a hat tip to him on the Whiteside call. But I mentioned DeMar DeRozan was the swerve off of Zach LaVine. And while I was over the field on DeMar DeRozan, I just played a little too much Zach LaVine. I really like LaVine. He dudded, and DeMar DeRozan did end up being the correct swerve. He was $500 less than LaVine, ended up scoring about 10 fantasy points more. And if I would have played, 25% DeRozan with 25% LaVine to sort of, even it out, is LaVine 37%, and DeRozan was 10%. So we're basically 4-1. Is Levine going to outperform DeRozan 4 out of 5 times in that particular spot, while also DeRozan being $500 less? And again, I think the clear answer to that is no. So I wish I would have stuck to my guns a little bit more and played quite a bit more DeRozan. But these are guys who, if you're looking back in results DB, this is how you try to figure things out. Like Tobias Harris was a great play. I liked Embiid, so a lot of my Philadelphia ownership went there. But a guy like Tobias Harris, who can hit threes against Milwaukee, who gives up a lot of threes at just 6%, amazing play. So that is one I was probably with the field on it, but that was just an amazing play if you happen to be on a guy like Tobias Harris last night. Another one was Julius Randle. On the show with Kirkwood, we both kind of came to the agreement last night that Randle was just going to have himself a pretty good night, and he ended up at just 6% ownership. Now, he was expensive, like $8,300, but the dude's still up towards the top here of the highest fantasy scores of the night. So you didn't have to have much, 15 to 20% Randle, and you're getting leverage on the field that way. So just kind of scroll through every night the high-scoring fantasy point players. Ask yourself why. Why was Elfrid Payton just 7% owned? Because he got an enormous price bump. And if you sort of, went against the logic of he's too expensive, well, you ended up having yourself a good lineup if you ended up using Elf Payton. Another guy was Trey Lyles. Now, I don't think we can ever expect Trey Lyles to score 43 fantasy points. He was just a lineup filler for cheap. He ended up being sort of the key to having a good lineup last night. So I want to transition. Let's see if I can find the right contest here. I got a lot of different ones up. That's the 100K. I think it's this one. So this is a contest. I put my 20 entries in here. And I wanted to point out different ways to play while also having, a shot at the top lineup, because all of these guys, Tyler, Nibbles, and Nanodoc, all split the top prize with the same lineup. It looks like two of them had pretty similar, ideas of what they were doing here. And then Nibbles, basically out of the blue, ended up on sort of the same lineup with them. It ended up being, let's see here. I can go back and take a look at it over here. So looks like the ownership isn't coming up. I'm going to refresh the page. Let's pray to the RotoGrinders gods, and we have ownership back up here. So here was the winning lineup in the 20 entry max last night. Kobe White. I was a little underweight Kobe White. I don't like being, high on the field. I knew he was going to play some good minutes. The shooter types, he ended up having 9 assists last night, which is very un-Kobe White-like. So he ran a little good. People got there with him. I think he ended up being a pretty reasonable play. The two plays that really allowed you to get to the top last night were Archie Dianaco, who was sort of like the Levine. I even thought he was like a Kobe White kind of, swerve trying to get away from Kobe White ownership. But you really needed to have both of them in the same lineup, which I don't think was ultra ideal, but it ended up working out last night. So what do I know? And then Chandler Hutchinson as well. And what I did notice is on Grinders Live, if you scroll through, I wish I could find the amount of lineups that played more than 3 Chicago players. I set my max of Chicago players to be 3 yesterday, on the players per team in lineup HQ, because even though there was so much value on Chicago, there's just no way that even though they're all cheap, more than like 3 guys are really going to get there in tournaments. And you kind of saw that across the board. I can click on all of these. Chicago, he's got 2. Jimmy's Cat, he's got 2 Chicago players. Sven's got 2 Chicago players. These guys all ended up on the same lineup. So this must have been, it's just Trey Lyles and Archie Dianaco. So like those 2 were basically the key to ending up on a top lineup last night. Let's go to like the next one. So Lunis, one Chicago player. So I really think limiting yourself to a 3 max Chicago player basically on any game, unless you're really game stacking and playing the overtime thing, is something you should, at least set it as a rule. And even when all the value, kind of comes in, is no matter what their cost is, it's just very, very hard for more than 3 players from the same team to get there, unless you're specifically playing a lineup that includes overtime. So always think about that if you're multi-entering or if you're hand building teams, when there's a lot of value on certain games. And that's going to be something for tonight too. Value is going to be everywhere tonight. So just make sure you're not getting too many value players from the same team. Trey Lyles was the other guy you sort of had to have 3% ownership. An outlier game, probably Trey Lyles' best game of the season. 3,200, you had to have him. Including a couple guys like that in your exposures, in the 1 to 2, if you're playing 20 lineups, having, 10% of them, having them in 2 lineups, I think is pretty good. I don't get too overly crazy on those guys because they're very hard to predict. But you can see like Tyler, Nibbles, and Nano. They all played Trey Lyles. Tyler, Trey Lyles in 60%, Nano Doc in 50%, and then Nibbles had him in about 13% of his lineups, right? So I think that's more the way I would play a guy like Trey Lyles. But if he fits into the value thing, who can really argue when these guys are hitting towards the top of the lineups and things like that? So I wanted to point out just a variety of different ways to play. If you look at Nibbles, 60% Aldridge, 60% Cornette, 60% Whiteside. I think this was obviously pretty good exposure except for Cornette. And you can see Cornette, all 3 of the guys who won also were at least with the field on Cornette. So, 60% of Nibbles' lineups were dead, but the other 40% of lineups were live, and he ended up having them, ended up winning this specific tournament, even when he's extremely overweight, a guy who extremely underperforms. There's, ways to do that in your exposure. And I like Nibbles specifically. Tyler, I don't think you needed to go 90% on players last night. It just wasn't the night to really do that, in my opinion. He went 90% on Archie Dianaco. Hat tip to him. That really worked out. But last night, I didn't think there were any real extreme value plays or anyone you really had to go 100% on. Of course, it looks good when you hit on your 100% guy that's 5% owned and he has himself a tournament-winning performance at his price. But I much preferred sort of Nibbles. I think I was sort of right in line with this. In fact, let's go. Give me 1 second here. Go back to the other screen. I was in here. Let's bring me up. We'll get a good laugh at my teams, boys. And Iowa. So I made 40 lineups last night and sort of randomized them. But you could see here, Iowa's 65% LaMarcus Aldridge, 45% Levine, right? I spread my ownership out, I think, a little bit more than some of these guys. And I just didn't see the need to go 100% on anybody last night. Tonight's going to be interesting because depending on who plays, who suits up through all these trades, there might be, let's pretend Porzingis doesn't play, right? And all the Dallas value comes in. There could be guys I might play 80, 90, 100% of tonight. So it varies from night to night. You got to think of it. And I'm much more apt to go 100% on the extreme value plays than even a guy like LaMarcus Aldridge, who, while he came through and was a good price, it's not like he was a $3,900 play that we thought could get 40 fantasy points. He still cost a reasonable amount of salary. So I basically had about 65% of him last night. I see a couple questions in chat. So I see Maxwell's back. He's got another question. Is going low-owned studs every night a solid strategy? Understanding you're going to maybe lose most nights, but on nights like last night, you're going to bink. And I think that's an interesting strategy. If I go back to the ownership page here, and we see Giannis was just 16% owned, right? He was expensive, but he had 72 freaking Draftkings points last night. And if you knew you were going to get 72 fantasy points out of Giannis ahead of time, you would basically be locking him in. And that is, I think that was well within his range of outcomes because he was going up against Philadelphia and what we thought would be a competitive game. So if you can, and it worked out with Westbrook too, right? Westbrook, it doesn't seem like a lot, right? 2.5 or 2.25 fantasy points more than LeBron James. But when you're trying to win, you know, a quarter of a fantasy point can separate first and fifth sometimes. And the way these tournaments are, you have to hit first. So playing the low owned, really good players on nights when there's a lot of them is certainly a way. Like Westbrook could easily have himself a great game, and he did, and he was sort of a key to getting up there. So I do think Maxwell. Look at the projected ownership. If you don't have it, you can get it as a RotoGrinders premium member. Judge for yourself, right? If I think we had LeBron around like 25% and Westbrook was, I don't know, low, I think he was right around 8%, if I recall. I could probably go look it up. But if you just think about it in these terms, is LeBron going to outperform Westbrook? These guys were basically the same price 4 out of 5 times, which is what the ownership is basically saying here. The answer to that is always going to be no. It's probably more like 60-40 at a max or 55-45. So when you play the ownership game, in theory, you would have wanted to play a little more Westbrook than LeBron James last night. The problem is, one, it's hard to physically click those names in day after day, or if you're in lineup HQ to set your ownership percentages to do that if you're MMEing. But in theory, I believe these are sort of the correct ways to play. I want to jump into what some of the pros did last night. So I've got a couple of this is from the $15 that you can put 150 entries in. And Grey Poupon won. He played 150 entries. All of these guys played 150. So let's take a look at what the winner did first and see if, I think there was anything egregious and sort of get an idea of what he was doing here. And, it's pretty easy to see why he won. His exposures basically hit on all of his top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players. And all of those guys he had leverage on over the field too. So he had Anthony Davis, who, looking back was a really good play, even though the field had him 31%. Grey Poupon had him at 84%. Now, I don't think I would ever make that big of a jump on a guy like Anthony Davis. I probably would have been maybe 60% last night if I thought he was an amazing play. Ben Simmons, right? He gets an insane amount of leverage, 4X's the field on Ben Simmons. He's overweight on Kobe White. McCollum wasn't the reason he won, but McCollum had himself a good day at his price range, and he's like 5X the field on that. He liked Embiid just like I did. He's 4X the field on Embiid. He's right at the field on Aldridge. Archie Dianaco at 29 fantasy points at 5%. He's at 31%. So I don't know if I like Kobe White and Archie Dianaco both. That much exposure to both. I don't mind if you don't play them on the same lineup. So I think maybe those guys got a little lucky, but hey, having a little bit of luck in DFS comes in every single night. So I like Grey Poupon's ownership. I mean, there's a very easy to see reason why he won last night. Brick 75, I've talked about him on a lot of my shows. He's someone I always like to see what he's doing because I think he's one of the better 150 players night in, night out, at least in terms of strategy. So let's see what he did. He was overweight on the Bulls, it looks like, across the board. Thad Young, Zach LaVine. I'm not sure if he played more than 3 in the same lineup. That was a thought I had last night. I'd have to go look through those. What I do notice is he doesn't have, I guess he does have a ton of, he's got a lot of Lonzo Ball. He had a lot of Derek Favors. So maybe he was trying to game stack a little bit with those, and that's why his ownerships got a little swerved into that. But, this just looks like a very non-Brick 75 night. Maybe he was in a rush last second and didn't have a time to apply all the stuff he normally did. But, this just looks a little different from what I normally see from him, unless he specifically wanted to go a little game stack heavy. That's what it looks like to me, with a lot of Chicago. Really overweight on Favors, really overweight on Lonzo Ball. He had 30% Rondo. I did like Rondo a little bit. The field was at 14%, but having 30% of a guy that gets you 1.5 fantasy points, that's just a killer for your overall return on that night. So I'm going to guess Brick didn't have himself the greatest night in the world. Squirrel Patrol, who I've done quite a few of the Roto Academy shows with, he's always basically said he doesn't really go more than 80% on a player. And his thought process seemed to be in line with mine last night, where not on the specific players, but at least on the capped ownership, where I wasn't really over 60% on any player last night because I wanted to have a little bit wider variety of players, and that seems what Squirrel Patrol did as well. He was 60% on LeBron James, had a great game. 52% on a Giannis who has 72.5. It looks like Luke Cornett really killed him, but the field had a lot of Cornett as well. He nailed LaMarcus Aldridge. He nailed Kobe White. The Kevin Knox play. Squirrel, dude, what are you doing? Everybody knows Kevin Knox sucks, dude. Just tailor down your Kevin Knox ownership, and you would have had yourself a huge night last night, buddy. But it looks like he was on a lot of guys. I'm going to assume 50% Kevin Knox at 2. Really sort of set him back in his overall exposure. But I like where he was sort of on the right track. And then A.E. Jones, he's won a lot of money playing NBA basketball over the year. Also, 50% cap. I think that was pretty reasonable last night as well. So he nailed Davis. He nailed Embiid. A lot of Danny Green, who actually performed pretty well last night. So he nailed that. He nailed LaMarcus Aldridge. If I go to entries, let me find where's Mr. A.E. Jones. I would imagine let's see. Don't even see him up here. Man, looks like he nailed everything. This X Relius too. I want to take a look at his ownership. I'm going to pop this in here real quick because he littered the top 10 last night, or basically every one of these top lineups. So I'm going to take a look at what he did. And he did it this is what I figured he did. Extremely overweight, like all the guys who had great days. Overweight. I don't think I could ever imagine playing 90% of a player who's projected at sub 10%. But when you do this and it hits, this is what it looks like. You get 5th, 6th, 9th, 15th, 16th. I can't believe the dude did not win last night with this sort of ownership and exposure and sort of nailing the plays across the board. Cannot believe he didn't win. I'm going to, he's got 65% Trey Lyles. He had all the Archie Diacono. I can't believe this guy didn't win. He, in theory, I think he ran extremely bad to not take down like almost $150,000 in this tournament. But this is what can happen. Very risky, right? Because if you're wrong on the 90% play that's 10% owned, you are basically done for the night immediately. So very risky strategy, but even though he didn't win 100,000, he had himself a very good night, in my opinion. And you could just see over 150 lineups. I'm going to guess he had 30-ish players, just a really, really tight player pool, probably just played one player per lineup different and really just played his guys. If they had good nights, he was going to do good. And if even one or two of these guys in the top 5 have even a reasonably bad night, he's probably not even going to come close to making his money back on the night. So just a lot of strategies across the board, across all the players who did well. I think last night, Squirrel Patrol and A.E. Jones, at least from what I like to play, sort of mimic my play style in terms of at least the limiting of the top play to like the 50, 60%. That sort of was I was on last night. Let me read through a couple of questions here. Let's see. Don't really see too much on here. So I want to talk about tonight's contest on DraftKings, because this is basically, if we're all DFS players and we want to have a chance to win some money without really spending a ton, this is a tournament I think you have to give yourself a shot to play tonight. You are playing against all the pros, but instead of it being a $15 buy-in or a $20 buy-in where it costs $3,000 to enter, it's only $4 to enter tonight. So I'm going to have my 150 in here, right? I don't, I don't like playing $1,500 or $3,000 a night in MME, but at 600, I can pull the trigger on that. And if, a chance to win 100,000, it doesn't really come across that often in basketball for a low dollar amount. What I do want to point out is this is a 118,000 person contest, basically 119,000 person contest. And the large prizes on DraftKings, where you win 100,000 to first, are usually about 30,000, 35,000 person tournaments. So you have to play this a little differently, I think, to win. And the one good thing is we just had a contest like this a couple of days ago. It was at the $1 level. And we can sort of take a look at some of the entries that won and kind of look at their total ownership. Let me see if I'm going to reload this page. And just sort of try to get a look of what won. So this guy won, it was $5,000, right? But the key here is this was 119,000 person tournament. And here's what happens when you get to 119,000 person tournament is you start creeping in, if you play like the 30,000 person large tournaments, you don't really see a ton where there's like 10% owned guys. But this is what happens when you start having 100,000 person in an NBA tournament. A lot of sub 10% owned guys end up in the winning lineups. So here we have two. This was a pretty chalky lineup, if you ask me. But then he nailed the two low-owned plays with Kyle Lowry and Derek Jones. Again, Jordan McLaughlin, Derek Jones. What you're going to need to do in these large field 100,000 plus NBA tournaments is I think you have to aim for 2 to 3 10% owned guys or less in basically every single lineup. You see this across the board on these, and it's a lot of the same guys, but the key is just having the ability to beat 119,000 people in an NBA tournament. This is sort of like the Millionaire Maker series I've done all year in football, right? Where there's like 300,000 people in an NFL tournament. And basically you have about 2.5 sub 5% owned players in NFL on the average top 10 lineup in those. And I think in NBA, you're not going to get that much. And I think you can move the goalpost to 10% in NBA because it's a little bit more projectable. But basically, every one of these top 10 lineups has at least 2, if not 3, sub 10% owned plays. So if you're playing this specific tournament tonight, I'm going to be in here likely for 150 lineups. And even if you're building by hand, take a look at our projected ownership. The projected ownership that comes up right now, it's not even up because guess what? No one has really any clue who's playing tonight. But you need to find a couple of players tonight if you're playing that DraftKings tournament that are going to be sub 10% owned or less, not just one, but probably 2 of them, if not 3, and get those dudes into your lineup. So I've got a couple for you. And if you were just watching this, wait, where'd it go? Here it is. You'll see, let's find, here we go. We've got Kyle Lowry at 6%, 62 fantasy points. I liked Lowry quite a bit on that night. Guess who's going to be 6% owned or less tonight and has the exact same matchup he just had. Now his price went up $600, but he just dropped 62 on the Pacers. He's playing them again. This is a close game. Toronto doesn't have, there's no trades. There's no, guys who everyone's going to flock to on Toronto tonight. But I like the Toronto players. Lowry just dropped the big game, but everyone else across the board, Pascal Siakam was 7,800 in this game, dropped 49. He's 7,500 tonight. Like, everyone's going to just play Harden and all of the 3 to 5K guys that got traded and all that type of stuff tonight. That's what tonight's lineups are going to look like. So I'm going to be paying very close attention to the ownership on Toronto tonight, because these guys, they're in the exact same spot. If the game's competitive, you're going to get huge minutes from the known quantities of Ibaka, Van Vliet, Lowry, and Siakam. I think Terrence Davis might get a little bit of a bump in minutes. He's a little bit riskier. Did post the one big game. You're probably chasing the 40 fantasy points. But the big four, Ibaka, Van Vliet, Lowry, and Siakam, they're all too cheap. Ibaka, 33 minutes, 6,300. He was 6,100, played 34 minutes, dropped 45 fantasy points last time out. I mean, these guys are players that nobody's going to have. Everyone's going to min-max tonight, which is usually the strategy, but Toronto are certainly guys I'm going to try to mix in to my lineups tonight. So if you're on YouTube or in RotoGrinders, right? Who are some guys you think are going to be low owned? We don't have projected ownership out yet. Give me some guys, right? Tell me who you think can be a sub 10% owned player that can end up in your tournament winning lineup that beats $119,000 people. Let me know. Let's walk through this and see if we can find a couple of guys. I want to get some feedback from you. There's going to be a lot of, trade stuff moving around. If you go to like Draftkings and you look at a team like Atlanta, right? Like, look at this. Everybody's questionable or out. You go to Boston, it's the same thing, right? It's really hard to figure out who's going to play right now. But give me a couple of guys. Who do you think is that sub 10% owned guy that could possibly win a tournament? And give me a little reason why, too. So I see Rui Hachimura in here. So he's back. He's probably going to play. He probably bumps up a little bit from 25 minutes in his last game. We've currently got him at 29 minutes. Washington made some trades. Is Napier going to end up playing? He may or may not. So Rui is slightly interesting, right? This game's got a huge total. If Porzingis doesn't play, that's a big body out for Dallas that really controls the boards. Maybe Rui can get there on the boards. The one problem with Rui that I run into is if you scroll down to back when he was playing, he's basically a points and rebounds player. Sure, he'll get a couple of assists, but there's generally not too many steals and blocks. He needs these 30-plus minutes. He's not going to play 42, 38 minutes. I highly doubt that tonight. And that's where we were really seeing him have these big games. He was also a little bit more expensive. I think he's a fine play. I don't think he's someone I'm going to go out of my way to get a ton of exposure to unless I expect him to play about 32 minutes. The price looks good. There's going to be so much value tonight that he's not someone I'm going to specifically go to. Reggie and Wood at 6K, right, on Detroit. So everybody's out for Detroit. And I think we can expect huge minutes from Reggie Jackson. Dropped 48 last time out. There's still no Derrick Rose. I guess this is easier to bring up on DraftKings because you can actually see all the outs, right? Markieff Morris is out. Luke Kennard's out. Is Henson going to play? Right, Henson got traded yesterday. Highly unlikely he's going to end up playing today, having to travel to OKC, right? So I doubt those guys get in there. Mikhailuk's out. All these guys are out. So I still think Christian Wood, depending on his ownership's not going to be through the absolute roof tonight. So if it comes in at like 15%, I have no problem being higher on Christian Wood. If Jackson comes in at 15%, right, I have no problem being a little bit higher on him. If these guys start pushing the 30 to 35%, you've got to take a long look, right? Like, it's a big slate. There's a lot of value out there. I still think they're good plays, but it's really going to depend what the ownership comes in on them. So that 15, I don't see those guys being sub 10%. So that's not the key to winning tonight. But it's really going to depend. If they're really high owned, 30%-ish, maybe you look to be a little underweight. If they're coming in 15, I have no problem moving up to about that 30% range. Let's see. Let's go to the Heat. The Heat have a lot of questions too. I'll go to the last game of the night. So good luck trying to figure out what's going to happen here. But, Derek Jones Jr. had himself the massive game. And he's an amazing FanDuel play, depending on what his salary is over there. Looks like 5,200 because he can rack up, 6 or 7 blocks and steals combined in a single game. But he got there last game, 47 fantasy points. If, some of these guys don't suit up for the Heat that got traded, Jimmy Butler's still out. I think Derek Jones, Dragic, Duncan Robinson, I think you can pick some of these guys. It's just, I don't even know if the extreme value plays are going to be, super high owned tonight because there's just going to be so many of them. But Steven in the YouTube chat, right? Like, I think Duncan Robinson, none, Dragic, Derek Jones Jr. If everyone's going to the 3 to 4K guys, if you get a couple of the 4K guys in there that are really good values that I think have some really high expectations, those guys look really good to me if their ownership comes in low. We'll get a couple more questions. Not going to spend too much time on tonight. I just don't think the analysis is really going to be on par till we really figure out who's going to be in and out tonight. Olynyk, no. The answer is never Kelly Olynyk. I know he's 3.3K, but I don't think I will have any Kelly Olynyk in my player pool. Hat tip to you if he gets you the 30 fantasy points and ships you a tournament, but I don't think I'll be playing any Kelly Olynyk. I'd much prefer the Robinson through Dragic price tier on the Miami players. So Brandon Clark, if no J-Val. So Memphis is slightly interesting too, right? They traded a couple people around. They're going up against Philadelphia. Now, I think Valanciunas is going to play. He's a pretty tough dude. I expect him to play, but if he doesn't, right? Yeah, of course you're going to play Brandon Clark and Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja. These guys, like Ja, he was popping off for these 40 fantasy point games. A couple of underperforming games, right? He had this really low scoring game against Detroit. A blowout here, a blowout there has sort of lowered his minutes and lowered his fantasy production. He is just 6,200 against Philadelphia tonight. So, or 6,200. So a guy like Ja, he screams that sub 10% on play that can get there. And I like him quite a bit. And so like if Ja's projected ownership is 5% tonight, because everyone's min-maxing and playing all the value plays elsewhere, I think Ja's going to be an extremely good play. Let's see here. We'll get a couple other ones. Mike Conley, I don't know. Maybe he's back. Maybe he's not. He's 5,400. This is really going to depend on ownership. So back-to-back really good games, and he sort of filled the stat sheet across the board, playing a lot of minutes. I don't know. He's someone I'm really going to have to tinker with. I'm going to have to think about if he's popular. He is a almost certain underweight for me in my 150 lineups. If he's like 10%, maybe I have a little more, but he's certainly not someone I'm going to stake my entire night on in tournaments. And if he's high owned, I can guarantee you I'll have a little bit lower than that. Simmons isn't going to let Ja ball. I mean, whatever. I don't, sure, you can think that. That's going to make Ja a little bit lower owned, which is perfect for me. Embiid, if he has low ownership again, people are just hating on him. Like, he shot 6 of 26. I repeat, 6 of 26. Still had 45 Draftkings points. He's going up against Memphis. He was 9,100 last night. He is 8,500 tonight. If Embiid sneaks under the radar of 20% or less, I will be doubling the field with Joel Embiid tonight for sure in tournaments. I got a question on DraftKings cash. This is probably going to be the last one I'm going to answer. And Eric, I would like to answer you that, but we don't know who's playing tonight. There's too many guys who could be in from trades. There's too many injuries. I think it would be disingenuous for me to basically give you any sort of cash game advice. So I would encourage you to check back on the core plays on RotoGrinders later. watch Grinders live. If you're premium, watch Crunch Time. And that's going to be where you're going to want to go for the must-have plays of the day. It's really hard until we start getting news on who's in and who's out from both injuries and from trades tonight. So you're really going to have to pay attention tonight. And I think that's really going to lead this tournament to being wide open on DraftKings tonight. So again, if you're playing this tournament, go check back on Results DB. There was a 119,000 person tournament on the 5th. It was $1, right? But you see when you get these extremely large field NBA tournaments, start jamming in 2 to 3, 10% owned players or less, and basically every lineup you make, or I just don't think you have a shot at taking down the top prize tonight. So looks like someone said the ownership has come in. The ownership's going to have extremely wild swings as we get news throughout the day. Let's see here. I'm not getting any ownership, so at least on Lineup HQ, maybe on the ownership page, but I basically only look at Lineup HQ. Have some fun out there. I encourage you, even if you're just playing one lineup, you're really not, you only see this type of tournament on DraftKings once or twice a year, a $4 with a chance to win $100,000. You are playing against all the pros. There's going to be a ton of people putting in 150 entries, but this is the tournament. You know, as a DFS player, you have to give yourself a shot to play in, whether it's 10 lineups, 150. You got to get in this one tonight. And I would definitely, based off the results a little bit and just the knowledge of the extremely large field tournaments, make sure you're putting in a couple of these low-owned plays, or I don't really think you're going to have a chance at that top prize tonight. That's going to do it for the pregame show. I hope you guys had some fun. Always spend some time, whether it's yourself or watching the pregame show every day, going through Results DB, checking what the top players did, compare yourself against them, see what they're trying to do. I always say this, I do a lot of coaching one-on-one. It's tough to win long-term in DFS, but there are a lot of different ways to win in large field GPP tournaments. And you can see that basically by looking at the exposures of all of these, good players last night that put in 150. Everyone's got a different idea. Which idea is the best? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but a lot of different ways to play. So have fun experimenting. And if you play in this $400,000 tournament on DraftKings today, really, really think about ownership as you make your lineups. Have fun out there. Thanks for watching. I'm Britt, and we out ya.